Hello, my name is Bashayana Dimira, and today we're joined with Gianpiero Doebler, the translator of our newest publication, Poems by Angelo Lumelli. Welcome, Dr. Doebler.
Thank you.
Can you briefly introduce yourself and how you got into this text? And can you also say a few words to introduce Angelo Lumelli, the author of the book, to an audience that might not be familiar with his work?
I'm glad to. I'm Gianpiero Doebler. I'm a Los Angeles-based translator of Italian, and I specialize in texts that need some form of unique attention, like poetry, texts from the 1600s or 1700s, recipes, things like that. For this project, I was approached by poet Luigi Ballerini, who was my longtime mentor in the field of translation and in poetic studies, as well as my good colleague Gianluca Rizzo. They were both familiar with my previous work with poetry, which includes a volume published a few years ago by Agincourt, The Missing by Maurizio Cucchi. Angelo Lumelli was born during World War II, and he's from a small town on the border between the northern Italian provinces of Piedmont, where Torino is, and Lombardy, which is home to Milan. In 1970, when he was in his late 20s, Lumelli moved to Milan for a decade, and he became very active in that city's very rich poetry scene that started long before him and has continued after. And at the time, he came together with a number of other young poets who were both very critical of each other in a positive way and very supportive of each other's works. From this experience, he published his first book of poetry in 1977 called Cosa Bella Cosa, Thing Beautiful Thing, which marked the beginning of his production that would extend to the 2020s, to today. And he continued that even after he returned to his hometown of La Ramata in 1980, where on a day-to-day basis he was involved in other types of writing and professional activities. Lumelli's poetry is very much marked by things, by places, by pauses, by half-remembered or unique or obliquely referenced feelings and memories. It's a poetry that's very much intended to be read and thought through rather than just heard aloud. There's a variety of alignments, different verse lengths and breaks, parenthetical comments and brackets within parenthetical comments, and a lot of pauses, which is a word that he himself uses. These things that are really can only appreciated by someone looking at them on the page, or not only, but it is really one of the best ways to enjoy Angelo Lumelli's works.
The book is described as having rewriting Angelo Lumelli's poetic work. How do you approach the process of translating something that the author himself has restated? Does this add complexity to your translation work?
The poems in this volume are sometimes very significant rewritings of the poems, of the same poems with the same titles as they appeared in earlier published editions. But because Lumelli considers these new forms as the definitive versions, it didn't really affect how I approached them as the translator, because I was doing what he sees as the final version, or at least the version of this moment for these poems. In essence, notwithstanding their history, I was able to take and translate them at face value. That said, it was interesting to have the opportunity when I translated the introduction by Eugenio Gazzola to be able to translate and compare selected passages, both as they appeared originally and in the new versions. One interesting twist on this, though, is that with respect to rewriting, is that as I was translating and sharing versions of my translations with Lumelli for his review and advice, he continued to revise some of the versions of the Italian text as it appeared in the anthology as it was published in Italy in 2020. And so there again, I went with his new text, and he had to work with the publishers to say, okay, this is different from what we published in 2020.
So, how do you handle translations of humor, emotion, other subtle aspects that may not be easily transferred from one language to another?
I think the key to this is making sure you recognize those subtleties in the first place as you're going in. And this is where the experience of reading and rereading the poem in the original comes into play, although sometimes you don't discover those things until you're in the midst of the poems. But you really need to recognize when the poet is perhaps using a word in a playful or colloquial way, or when he is turning very serious. And as a translator, you need to employ English words that are of similar register, either of day-to-day speech or academic, not so much academic, but very serious register. And it's also important to do a careful reading and rereading of your own translation to make sure you've captured that. But I'll give you an example for in the long prose work that closes this volume. It's called The Revolving Door of the Hotel Excelsior. Lumelli starts in a somewhat playful tone. He describes the giving of an address at the end of a banquet, and says some very humorous things about that, the situation that many of us have always seen watching someone get up to give a speech. But that address, it turns into a very serious, theoretical, and almost academic discussion on the nature of poetry itself, on the nature of his poetry, and the supposed fixedness or permanence of the word on the page. And as we've said, that's something that his rewritings not work against. The challenges that notion of the fixedness.
You mentioned that during your translation, Lumelli will sometimes edit the original in Italian. What other ways translating Lumelli's work differ from your other translation projects?
One of the things that really distinguishes this from many of the other poetic translations I've done was the degree of encouragement and enthusiasm from the poet himself, from Lumelli himself. He's a very charming and gracious man, and it was a privilege to have that collaboration. And it's interesting because although he claims that his own English is not very strong, all of the communications that he and I had were exclusively in Italian. He is himself naturally a careful reader of poetry, and he was very willingly went through my translations, the English text of my translations. He was able to highlight points in that English that he said, well, look at this again. It needed to be revisited. For example, in a verse, that he thought that there were several times he said, well, I think maybe you could do something here that is more rhythmic, something that, even though this is not a poetry of traditional meter and rhyme or anything like that. I mean, there still is a cadence, a rhythm that you want to capture if you can. And there were a few places where he pointed out, said, well, maybe you can tweak this a little bit to have it flow more smoothly. And there were, and there's some cultural references that I hadn't missed, or colloquialisms that I didn't quite get. And he was very gracious in pointing out these areas. There's a great sensitivity in translating the work of a living poet who might see that translation, because you really want to represent the poet's intention and tone and register and, as you mentioned, the playfulness as closely as possible.
Can you share any interesting anecdotes or details about the translation process, whether specific passages or terms that presented unique challenges when translating from Italian to English?
Sure. In several places, for example, Lumelli uses terms in dialect rather than in standard Italian, the dialect that he grew up speaking. For example, in one, he uses dialect as an indicator of the seriousness, of the heartfelt emotion in a poem in which he or his poetic voice is addressing his late brother. This was a case where I needed to go back to Lumelli himself, and I, of course, had the good fortune of being able to do that, to ask if he could, they were short passages, but to ask if he could translate them into Italian for me so that I could translate them from Italian. There's another poem where, in a bit of playfulness and spontaneity, he uses 4 words that rhyme in Italian but really have nothing to do with one another and don't really affect the overall meaning of the poem, except to insert this notion of playfulness. Those words were rima, lima, stima, and prima. Just deliberately wanted to include words that rhymed. So in that case, I rather, included the Italian words and put a note at the bottom that in the original Italian these rhyme. As a translator of poetry, when you're translating poetry, one is very hesitant to add notes to a poem, but sometimes you just have to do it in order to not leave out completely a point that the poet was trying to make, or some really salient point in the original text.
Yeah.
And give you another example. There's a point where Lumelli uses the brand name of a product that's over 100 years old, is used to make sparkling water. hidrolitina, and it has a heavy nostalgic connotation to it. It's powder that you pour into water and it makes the water fizzy. Um, and so I had to talk to him about that. There simply is not an English word for it. So we settled on a term fizzy drink, which worked well in that context, even though fizzy drink is not necessarily a very poetic term in itself. Um, and translating, and particularly translating poetry, is always filled with such interesting little moments of discovery like that. Even if you're someone who's very familiar with the language and how it's used, you always have, I mean, and that's the part of the joy of poetry in any language, even one's own language, is discovering these ways that words work together and these references and these connections that you maybe didn't see before. I was very flattered to have Lumelli himself tell me that he thought that sometimes I had captured in the English, that I had seen nuances in the text that even he himself had not seen as the author in the Italian. And to a translator, that is some of the best possible praise that a translator could ever hear.
Yeah, thank you so much for discussing with us this remarkable publication. Poems is out now through Agincourt Press. You can find it wherever you get your books. Thank you.